It all began in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of a wealthy neighborhood where the lights of privilege gleamed from every corner but the shadows of loneliness lingered just as heavy, and inside lived a man named Richard Wallace, a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune through technology investments, but behind his wealth and his sharp-tailored suits there lived a father broken by fate, for his only daughter, Emily, once a vibrant girl who loved ballet and laughter, had been left paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident 2 years ago, an accident Richard never forgave himself for because he had been driving that night, too busy on his phone to notice the truck swerving into their lane, and though he survived with only minor injuries, Emily's life changed forever, confined now to a wheelchair, her dreams of dancing crushed, and Richard's guilt gnawed at him every night as he sat in his study staring at the portraits of her twirling in pink tutus from happier days, but wealth, as it often does, became his crutch. He hired the best doctors, the best therapists, the most expensive treatments in Europe and America, yet nothing brought back her ability to walk, and in her silence, her sadness, and her hollow smiles, Richard felt powerless for perhaps the first time in his life, a man who could bend markets but not fate, and so the mansion, though filled with marble floors, chandeliers, and priceless art, felt like a prison of regret, until one day, an unexpected rhythm echoed through its halls, faint at first, like the sound of footsteps or perhaps music, and Richard followed it quietly down the long corridor that led to the family ballroom, a room unused since Emily's accident, where the piano stood covered and the mirrors gathered dust, but when he pushed open the tall oak doors, he froze. There, in the center of the room, was Sophia, the maid's daughter, a girl of 16, moving gracefully across the wooden floor in a dance so filled with life that the silence of the mansion seemed to crack, her feet gliding, her arms stretching like wings, her expression lost in joy as though she carried music within her veins, and sitting just a few feet away, with tears streaming down her face, was Emily, clapping softly, her wheelchair positioned toward the light pouring through the tall windows, her eyes wide as though she had seen her own reflection of the past brought to life in Sophia's movements, and for a moment Richard didn't know what to feel. Anger that a servant's child had dared step into this room without permission, or astonishment that his daughter, who had hardly smiled in months, was actually laughing, a sound he thought he might never hear again, and he stood there, his voice caught, until Sophia noticed him and gasped, stopping mid-spin, her face turning pale, bowing her head and stammering apologies. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean, I was practicing, please don't be angry." But before Richard could speak, Emily turned toward him, her voice trembling yet firm. "Dad, don't be mad, she's helping me remember what it felt like to dance," and those words pierced Richard deeper than any boardroom betrayal or business failure ever had, because in that single sentence he realized his daughter had not forgotten her dreams, she had buried them alive, and here was this maid's daughter daring to unearth them, and so instead of lashing out, Richard did something unexpected, something even he didn't understand. He smiled, though it hurt, and he said softly, "Continue," before walking out of the ballroom, his heart pounding with confusion, and that night he sat awake wondering, replaying the scene again and again, asking himself why it felt like he had just witnessed a miracle, and over the next few days Richard watched quietly as Sophia continued to dance for Emily whenever she could slip away from her chores, sometimes twirling with ribbons, other times teaching Emily how to move her arms in rhythm, even making her laugh by pretending to stumble, and Emily began to light up in ways no expensive therapy ever managed, her laughter echoing through the halls again, and though Richard knew the rules of class, millionaire families do not mix with the staff, he found himself drawn to the sight, until one afternoon he walked in again, and this time instead of freezing he sat quietly in the corner and said, "Don't stop, show me how you make her smile," and so began an unlikely bond between a grieving father, a paralyzed daughter, and a maid's daughter who carried dance in her blood, and as days turned into weeks, Richard began to ask Sophia about her life, and he learned her mother, Maria, had worked in the mansion for years, cleaning quietly, never complaining, raising Sophia on her own after her husband abandoned them, and Sophia dreamed of becoming a professional dancer but had no money for lessons, so she learned by watching YouTube videos late at night, practicing in secret whenever the house was empty, her shoes worn, her dresses stitched from hand-me-down fabric, yet her talent shone brighter than many trained ballerinas, and Richard began to feel something stir inside him, not just admiration for the girl's courage, but the dangerous thought that perhaps she was the answer to something greater, and though he tried to dismiss it, he found himself thinking about how Sophia's joy could heal Emily, how maybe her presence was a gift he hadn't realized he needed, but life has a cruel way of turning when least expected. For one evening during a dinner party with Richard's wealthy friends, laughter filled the mansion until one of the guests, a sharp-tongued socialite named Victoria, wandered into the ballroom and found Sophia mid-dance with Emily clapping along, and the woman gasped loud enough for the crowd to gather, whispering, "What is this?" the fragile bubble Richard had allowed shattered as whispers spread among the guests, their judgment heavy, and Richard felt his pride burn, torn between defending what he knew was right and upholding the image of wealth he had worked his life to build. But when he looked at Emily's face, glowing with happiness, he made a choice that stunned everyone present. He stood, raised his glass, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching a miracle, because this girl is not just the maid's daughter, she's the reason my daughter is smiling again." And the room fell silent, shocked, until whispers turned into murmurs and murmurs into scandal. But Richard didn't care, not anymore, because for the first time since the accident he felt he was choosing his daughter over his image, and though that night ended with raised eyebrows and whispers in the wealthy circles, it was only the beginning of a story filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and redemption, because not everyone in Richard's world would accept Sophia, and not everyone in Sophia's world would forgive her for stepping into his. The fallout from that evening echoed far beyond the marble halls of Richard Wallace's mansion, for though he had stood proudly before his wealthy guests defending Sophia, the maid's daughter, as the light that brought joy back into his paralyzed daughter's life, the whispers of high society were relentless, and by the next morning articles had begun to circulate in the gossip columns, headlines dripping with scandal: "Millionaire defies class, praises maid's daughter, ballroom shock, servant's child dances for heiress," and for Richard, a man who had built not only a fortune but also a reputation for control, the sting of losing face in the eyes of his elite peers was sharp. Yet every time he considered silencing Sophia or forbidding the dances, he would see Emily's eyes, sparkling with hope again, and he could not bring himself to crush the fragile miracle unfolding before him, and so instead of retreating, Richard leaned in further, spending more time with the girls, even inviting a piano teacher to play live music during their sessions, though secretly, without telling anyone, because a war was brewing outside those mansion walls, and not all battles were waged with kindness. Meanwhile Sophia herself was caught in a storm of her own, for though her heart sang when she danced, she could feel the stares of the other staff members growing colder, some whispering behind her back that she was overstepping, that she was putting her mother's job at risk, and her mother, Maria, warned her sternly one night in their small servant quarters, "Mija, remember who we are. We clean this house, we do not belong to it, and the more you shine in front of them, the more danger you bring to us." But Sophia, though respectful, could not stop, because every time she saw Emily clap or laugh, every time she saw the wheelchair forgotten in the rhythm of music, she felt she was doing something that mattered more than scrubbing floors, and Maria, though fearful, could not deny the truth that perhaps her daughter's gift had been placed here for a reason. Yet fear lingered like a shadow in her heart, and rightly so, because trouble was indeed circling. One afternoon, as Richard met with investors in his private office, a man named Charles Harland, an old rival and ruthless businessman, brought up the rumors with a smirk, saying, "I hear your heiress is being entertained by a servant girl. Richard, careful, the board doesn't like when distractions enter the family image." And Richard, though outwardly calm, felt the words like knives, because Charles had always envied his success and now had ammunition to strike at him publicly. But Richard swallowed his pride and replied coldly, "The happiness of my daughter is no one's business but mine." Yet he knew then that this was no longer just about dance, it was about power, perception, and the fragility of the empire he had built. And meanwhile, Emily's own transformation continued to surprise everyone, for though her legs remained paralyzed, her spirit began to rise, and she started speaking more, engaging in therapy with renewed energy, even asking her father timidly one night, "Do you think I could learn to dance again, even in a chair?" And though Richard's heart broke at the innocence of her hope, he looked at her and said, "With the right teacher, I believe you can." And from that night Sophia began adapting her movements, choreographing new routines where Emily could use her arms, her upper body, her expressions, and slowly the girl who had once buried her dreams began to perform again. And Richard, watching from the shadows of the ballroom, sometimes found tears rolling down his face, though he never let the girls see, because he was afraid of hope, afraid that the cruel world would crush this fragile progress, and as fate would have it, his fear was not unfounded, for within weeks a storm broke when Victoria, the same sharp-tongued guest who had first exposed Sophia, returned with vengeance, confronting Richard at a charity gala, her voice dripping with poison as she declared loudly for others to hear, "Richard, I pity you. You've become so weak, letting a maid's child parade around your mansion as though she were an equal. What will people think of the Wallace legacy?" And Richard, usually a man of controlled responses, snapped in a way that stunned the crowd, slamming his glass on the table and saying, "Let them think what they want. My legacy is my daughter, not your approval." And though the room fell silent, whispers of rebellion spread, and Richard knew the line had been drawn, that he was no longer just protecting a child's happiness, he was defying the unwritten laws of wealth and class that governed their circles. But little did he know the greatest danger was not from society's whispers but from betrayal within his own home. because among the staff, resentment was brewing, and one night when Sophia returned to her small room, she found her mother sitting pale and shaken, holding a letter of dismissal signed not by Richard but by the head housekeeper, a bitter man who had long envied Maria's position, claiming Sophia had disrespected boundaries and caused scandal, and though Maria wept, saying they had to leave, Sophia refused, storming to Richard's study, banging on the door until he opened, and through her tears she showed him the letter, her voice trembling, "Please, sir, I never meant harm, I only wanted to help Emily. If we leave, she'll lose everything she just found." And Richard, reading the paper, felt a fury ignite, marching down to the staff quarters and tearing the letter to shreds before everyone, declaring, "No one dismisses Maria or Sophia without my word, do you hear me? They are part of this family now." And though the staff bowed, resentment deepened, and Maria herself pulled Sophia aside afterward, whispering harshly, "You don't know what you've done. Powerful people don't forgive humiliation." But Sophia, though shaken, held firm, because she believed fate had tied her to Emily for a purpose, and she was right, for only weeks later a twist none could have predicted would test them all. Emily, encouraged by Sophia, agreed to perform at a small charity event for disabled children, demonstrating that even in a wheelchair dance could live, and the performance, though simple, was breathtaking, with Sophia guiding Emily across the stage in a duet that moved the audience to tears, and Richard, watching, felt pride unlike any business triumph he had ever known. But the event was recorded and posted online, going viral within days, millions of viewers from the USA, UK, and beyond praising the courage of a paralyzed girl and her friend. Yet as applause spread across the internet, so too did darker voices, critics accusing Richard of exploiting a servant's child for sympathy, tabloids digging into Maria's past, Charles Harlan seizing the moment to smear Richard's reputation with headlines suggesting scandal between the millionaire and the maid's daughter. And though none of it was true, the damage was heavy, with investors threatening to pull out of deals, boards questioning his judgment, and for the first time in years Richard's empire trembled, but he did not retreat. He called a press conference, standing beside Emily and Sophia, declaring, "Judge me if you will, but I will not apologize for choosing joy over pride, for letting my daughter dream again." And though the statement was bold, the war had only begun, because in the shadows Charles and Victoria plotted to bring him down, and in the mansion walls bitterness festered among those who despised Sophia's rise, and Maria feared every moment that one mistake would destroy them, yet she could not stop what destiny had set in motion, for the bond between Emily and Sophia was no longer just about dance, it was about survival, about defying a world that told them where they belonged. And as chapter 2 closed, Richard, though battered by scandal, stood taller than ever, determined to fight for his daughter's happiness, unaware that the darkest betrayal was yet to come, and it would come from someone he trusted most. The days that followed Richard Wallace's public defense of Sophia and Emily were some of the most turbulent the mansion had ever known, for though his words at the press conference had moved many ordinary people to admiration, earning praise from families in the USA and UK who saw in his defiance a father's love over society's shallow pride, the backlash in elite circles was ferocious, and behind the marble doors of his empire's boardrooms whispers turned into rebellion, investors grew restless, and stock prices trembled, but Richard stood unmoved, his focus fixed not on the wealth he might lose but on the fragile joy he had fought to preserve for his daughter. Yet even as he braced himself against the storm of public opinion, a far more dangerous tempest brewed within his own walls, for someone close to him, someone he trusted, was quietly weaving betrayal into the fabric of his life, and it began one cold evening when Emily fell ill, her body weak after weeks of pushing herself in therapy and dance routines, and Richard called for the family doctor, only to discover a chilling truth. The doctor revealed that Emily's medication had been tampered with, replaced with ineffective substitutes that could have endangered her life, and though Richard's heart raced with fear and rage, he asked himself the unthinkable: who within his trusted circle would dare to harm his daughter? And as he launched a private investigation, what surfaced shook him to the core, for it was not an enemy from outside but the head housekeeper, the same man who had once tried to expel Maria and Sophia, who had been secretly bribed by Charles Harlan to sabotage Richard by targeting Emily's health. And when confronted, the man confessed bitterly that he had grown resentful watching Sophia rise from servant's child to the center of attention, feeling that his decades of loyalty had been overshadowed by a girl with nothing but dance. And though Richard fired him on the spot, the betrayal cut deep, not only because his daughter had been placed at risk but because he realized that the world he had built on power and wealth was rotting from within. And yet amid the darkness, a spark of light remained. Emily recovered quickly, her spirit unbroken, and insisted on continuing her rehearsals with Sophia, saying with a determination that stunned even her father, "If they want to silence us, we'll just dance louder." And those words became a rallying cry, a seed of defiance that would soon bloom into something greater than any of them imagined. For Richard, inspired by his daughter's resilience, decided to do what no one expected. he announced that he would sponsor Sophia's formal training in one of the most prestigious dance academies in London, declaring publicly that her talent deserved to be nurtured, not hidden. And though critics screamed of scandal, the world outside the bubble of the elite erupted with support, ordinary families praising him for lifting up a girl from humble roots, but not all celebrated, for Charles Harland, enraged at Richard's growing popularity among the public, launched his most vicious attack yet, spreading false rumors that Richard had inappropriate ties with Sophia, that the relationship between Millionaire, Maid's daughter, and Paralyzed heiress was scandalous, and though Richard's lawyers fought fiercely to silence the lies, the headlines grew uglier. Emily herself became a target of cruel comments online, and Sophia's once joyous spirit began to crack, one evening breaking down in Emily's room, sobbing, "Maybe they're right, maybe I don't belong here, maybe I've only made things worse." But Emily, though still fragile in body, lifted her friend's chin and whispered fiercely, "You belong with me, with us, because you gave me back my life, and I don't care what they say." And those words bound the girls together even tighter, a bond of sisterhood unshaken by the cruelty of the world. And Richard, overhearing, realized that no scandal, no rumor, no betrayal could undo what was real, that Sophia had restored to his daughter something priceless, and so he vowed to fight to the end. And fight he did, for the climax came when Charles, in desperation, attempted to stage a hostile takeover of Richard's company, leveraging the scandal and rallying the board against him. And in a heated meeting filled with shouting and accusations, Richard stood alone against a sea of raised hands ready to dethrone him. But just as the final vote neared, the doors burst open and in walked Emily in her wheelchair, escorted by Sophia, her eyes blazing with determination, and she demanded to speak, silencing the room with her trembling but firm voice, declaring, "You may take away his company, you may take away his reputation, but you will never understand what he gave me. He gave me a reason to live when I thought my life was over, and he gave Sophia the chance to shine when no one else would. So if you think kindness and love are weaknesses, then I pity you." And her words, though spoken softly, carried a weight that no shareholder could deny. And in that moment the tide turned, some members of the board lowering their hands, others shamed into silence, until Charles stormed out, defeated, his plot undone not by power or money but by the voice of a girl the world had once dismissed. And though Richard lost allies that day, he gained something far greater, freedom from the chains of pride that had long ruled him. And as months passed, the mansion transformed, no longer a prison of regret but a home of music and resilience, with Emily continuing her therapy, now learning wheelchair dance professionally, Sophia excelling at the London Academy under Richard's sponsorship, and Maria finally holding her head high after years of servitude. But the true climax came a year later, when Sophia performed on a grand stage in London, dedicating her routine to Emily, who sat in the front row with her father, tears streaming down her face as she saw her dreams reborn in Sophia's movements. And at the end of the performance, Sophia wheeled Emily onto the stage, the two of them performing a duet that brought the entire audience to their feet in thunderous applause. And Richard, standing, realized that the story had never been about scandal or wealth. It had been about broken people healing each other, about unlikely bonds shattering the walls society built. And when he stepped forward to join them on stage, the world saw not a millionaire with a maid's daughter, but a father, a daughter, and a friend who had defied fate together. And the legacy Richard Wallace left behind was not his fortune, nor his company, but the truth that sometimes miracles don't come from wealth, or doctors, or status, they come from the courage of those the world overlooks. And that is why when people asked years later what stunned everyone most about the story, it was not that a millionaire had defended a maid's daughter, nor that a paralyzed girl had danced again, but that love, in its purest form, had triumphed over pride, prejudice, and betrayal, leaving behind a legacy that even scandal could never erase.